and walk the path. So I think the resolve part of it is obviously is about our steadfastness in our practice. And so this is the main crux of today's teaching. So let's look at initial verse. Our time is painfully short. Okay, we know that the time is short. Why is it painful? I mean, painful from two perspectives. If we cling on to life, it will be very painful. But if we understand that the purpose of life, then we notice that because in this human realm, that's the best chance for us to cultivate. And if the kalpa is in the trillions of years, and we only got a few decades of practice, so from that perspective, it's painful. So we must not let it pass in vain. So instead, we must seize the moment and sustain it forever. So what do you mean by sustaining it forever? Sustain forever meaning whatever we cultivate in this lifetime can go into the mind continuum. And that is important to understand. So whilst we then establish the purpose of life in here, then how do we sustain forever? So sustaining it forever is how do we get engaged in a meaningful practice and not linger in enjoyment. So, and it's important to understand and say not linger, because this one doesn't say that you should not be happy in life. It never say that you shouldn't enjoy your life, but do not linger, do not get attached or indulge in that pleasure. Also, because if you do, then we stray from the right path, because we'll gravitate and be bounded by worldly pleasures. So we cultivate our mind and refine our character to walk the great path. So cultivate our mind, and the door to enlightenment is through the mind. Refine our character, as you all know that quite often. I mentioned that the purpose of our cultivation is to change our character. And to change our character, we need to get to know ourselves to do that. So here in the explanation that our time is painfully short, so we must not let it pass in vain. So that means if you don't let it pass in vain, that means do not suffer in vain. You see, if you look at the Four Noble Truth, right? The first truth is the truth of suffering. So that's what life is. So we have to go through that, because our karmic retribution will arise. Whether you're in practice or not, it will come, right? Those are the circumstantial karma. And but if it arises and we do not get in practice, we're letting it pass in vain. So we're suffering in vain. But if the light becoming manifests in us, and as a result of which we accept that, we make peace with it, and we practice with it. So we learn from it, repay it, and fulfill it. Then that is living the wisdom life. So although karmic conditions arise and cease, true principles of the Dharma are everlasting. The true principles of the Dharma is everlasting. That means it doesn't change. And so this is the part that, okay, I'll come to that later on. We can uphold them for the rest of our life and vow to continue to do the same in the next. This is the part that practicing into the mind continuum, so that in our next slide, we'll immediately pick up from where we left off, continuing this cycle. But this is the part that is to get into this meaningful practice. I've explained before that when we get into a meaningful practice and we learn the Dharma, that if the learning is very attached to our intellectual mind, which is knowing and understanding, it will die with the mind. But if we bring it up to raise our level of consciousness, because when we raise our level of consciousness and going back to the initial verse about the refining the character, and that is the part, because when the character changes, it will change your summon consciousness. When summon consciousness changes, it will deposit that when we die, just summon consciousness will deposit to 8, which is the storehouse. And this is the part that comes from realization. And that realization, we can't stop there. We got to bring that realization into the practice. So although the Buddha had entered parinirvana nearly 2,500 years ago, the Dharma he thought is still alive in the world today. It's what we call the Dhammakaya. So the Dhammakaya, so far as the Dharma is concerned, is still there. The Dhammakaya does not arise or cease. This is the part that I shared with you all a few days ago and also some time back, that the Dharma is weatherproof. So whether there's calamities, whether it's major calamities or minor calamities, and the ceasing of the kalpa, the Dharma will still be there. And that's what I mean by Dharma is weatherproof. So when the elements changes, or whether there's going to be war, whether it's going to be famine or pestilence, the Dharma will remain. So it's everlasting and it existed since beginningless time. And beginningless time, and the Buddha referred to that time, it's beyond comprehension by the worldly mind, and we can't even tell when Dharma began. And for us, for our afflictions and the karma we accumulated, and it's been innumerable lifetime, and that is what this is since the beginner's time. So to cultivate our minds and refine our character, we must use every moment to take the Buddha Dharma to heart. So we must earnestly refine our character, inspired to make great vows. So making these great vows that we do is two things that we need to understand. One part of it is for internal cultivation, one is for external cultivation. But this can only arise from understanding what is the purpose of life and what is the meaningful practice that we undertake. So in the Bodhisattva path, so we must cultivate with the, so we must cultivate the 4 infinite minds, loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. And you all know what these are. So in having loving kindness, we willingly give to others and without regrets for the benefit of sentient beings. And with great compassion, we dedicate ourselves to relieving suffering of others without complaint, resentment, or discontent. And this is the vow we have undertaken. This is the Bodhisattva vow for the benefit of others. So with joy, we give to others peacefully and at ease without worries. So equanimity, and this is one of the greatest part to practice, because see, we are in a desire realm. There are emotions in us. And when you have emotion, whatever changes of condition that arises will change our emotion. And therefore, we either get very averse to things we do not like, or we get to very near to things that we like. So, and to get into the unconditional practice, we need to be able to be in stillness or in samadhi, then whatever changing conditions they may be. So for us, we must be able to give willingly and without expectation. And that's one of the practice to teach us and to learn towards the unconditional practice. So on the Bodhisattva path, internally, we cultivate the 4 great vows, and externally, we practice the 4 infinite minds. So in this cultivation, or internal cultivation and external cultivation, so the internal cultivation is what is rooted the 4 great vows. And what that 4 great vow means, internally we need to cultivate sincerity, integrity, faith, and steadfastness. And obviously in external cultivations, loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. So the lessons learned. And this is our form, and as well as we need to understand that very clearly, and I explained earlier. So we must not deviate from the right path at all. We must cultivate our minds, refine our character, and walk the great path. This is the cause for us in a future life. So walking this right path that we're in right now is so that whatever we do, and I must have said this before, we cannot have the slightest deviation, because that will take us off course. Because if the journey is so long, a slight deviation will put us off tension into our future lives. So the children's flawless seeds of word transcendence do not arise easily. So the fact that we are in this human realm and encounter the Dharma, we need to learn to transcend this worldly life. And to do this, we need to get into flawless studies, precept, samadhi, and wisdom, which for us, we are still covered in dust of ignorance and greed. So, and we can easily burn fire. So we need to realize that. And instead is part by what I mean by, it's not good just knowing, understanding. So we got to realize, the thing is that even if we learn the Dharma, the problem is that even when we learn the Dharma, we do not realize ourselves. Meaning realize ourselves, meaning we do not realize or recognize our own afflictions. So, and Master say that for solitary realizers, Pachika Buddha says, I understand the Dharma, I will eliminate my affliction, I must cultivate the precept, samadhi, and wisdom, the flawless studies. This was not easy for this to happen. So the Buddha came to the world and taught for more than 40 years before they truly listened to his word. So imagine for those cultivators who have taken full time, and even for those who are taken full time in a monastic, I find it difficult to understand. So therefore, this shows the depth of the Buddha Dharma that we need to get engaged into. And this is the part that I mentioned about getting in a meaningful practice. And for us as a householder, we are not as bounded by the precepts and the vow. So we need to undertake that practice steadfastly ourselves. So in summary, everyone intrinsically has a nature of true suchness equal to the Buddha. And that is the understanding and aspiration we should set. And we do so with the aspirational vows. But because we haven't brought it to spiritual maturity, so obviously we find that great difficulty. So how do we do that? So we have to nourish our karmic seeds. So then this seeds have now been sown. So we need to purify our seeds, and why we do that by nourishing with both the internal and external cultivation and getting engaged in a steadfast practice. So in contemplation, it is from our experiential learning that nurtures the gain in wisdom, as I mentioned earlier. So the life that we undertake in this life, the life becomings will before us. But when we do, we learn the lessons from that, and that is experiential learning. That's what the Dharma is about, and that's where we can gain in wisdom. But do not look down on the humble potential. Just like a seed that we look down, it won't even know how big the tree can grow. So there's nothing in a humble seed that shows it will grow into a giant tree. And it's a small seed. So therefore, the dharmic seed that you have planted has great potential to grow into a tree of wisdom. So on relationship, I may have shared with you before, but I think it's useful to see a different angle in this context. It takes a flare of emotion to burn a relationship that will precipitate an adverse affinity. And very often, we do not know that, because then this is what Master mean by equanimity and also engaging in an unconditional practice. But the problem is that we have the 6 roots. And when the 6th root get engaged with the dust, and that's where the sixth consciousness will arise. So it takes a lifetime to build a good affinity at a moment to destroy it. So be mindful with that. So we must therefore be aware of the rising of the wholesome feeling. So how do we practice this? We practice this with deep awareness of our inner self, and that's why we have to go constantly, continuously do our self-reflection. So before it arises, and that is what the practice of all right efforts is. Okay, Gan En brothers and sisters, that's all.
Yeah, endless gratitude to our brother Chin. Just can't thank you enough.